I recently visited the US for the first time in 3.5 years. So I hadn't been back to the US since before the COVID-19 pandemic. And I have to say, as an American that's been living in Sweden for over 6 years now, it's very interesting the impact that a society and a culture has on an individual. I mean, in my case, pretty much the entirety of my adult life, I found myself in Sweden, whereas 21 out of my first 22 years of living were in the US. So it's really interesting how my perspective and lens has shifted, my thought process on just living life in general, being in Sweden for so long, because I consider myself to be now a blend of the impact that America had on me as a kid growing up and living in Sweden for so long. I feel like I have a very interesting cultural mix of both places. And so going back to the US for the first time in a very long time, it made me view my home country through a different lens. And it made me think about weird things that Americans do, or maybe it's not so weird. Maybe it's weirder in Sweden, but the bottom line is it's just different. The first thing that I noticed going back to the US is just how easy it is to talk to people, in the sense of that people are very open about their life story. One instance where this really hit home for me, because I was on a flight from LA to Portland, and this lady sitting next to me on the flight, basically we started off with some small talk, and then she started to open up about her whole life story, how she had a hip replacement and was having medical problems, and how she wasn't sure where she was gonna live, and she had kids and all over the world. And I'm thinking, in this first interaction, to learn so much about somebody's personal life, it doesn't happen very often in Sweden. People are more private about their private lives. It also made me think about how the systemic differences when she's talking about not having a place to live, perhaps being homeless, having to rely on her kids. We don't have the same sort of social safety net in the US that we have in Sweden. So there's a lot of just normal people that are down on their luck, that are going through a difficult time in the US, whereas of course there's people in Sweden that are going through a difficult time as well, but there is a sort of social safety net to the society that the average person is really well taken care of, they're insured. Definitely some interesting differences there. Another interesting difference I found about the US is how polarized politically the US is as a society. I mean, when you look at the political parties in Sweden, there are a lot of differences from party to party, and there are some parties in Sweden that have been quite controversial, but I feel like because there's a multi-party system, everyone can find a party that sort of aligns with them the most, and then they kind of form blocks, like the blue bloc and the red bloc, and then you have the sort of Swedish Democrats, which is a quite controversial party in Sweden, more of a nationalistic party. But in the US, you basically just have two options, and they're like polar opposites from each other. And there might be things that you agree with on one party, but then there's on the other side, there's things that you agree with and disagree with. And I find myself in this situation a lot where I don't feel like I realistically like to be pulled to either side. I find myself somewhat in the middle, and it's very interesting because I would play this game where we'd be watching a news story on CNN or MSNBC in the US, and then I would switch over to Fox News just to hear the complete opposite side. One example, I remember the top news story on CNN this day is when Trump had 37 allegations in front of him and he had to go to court. A lot of serious accusations and allegations against Trump. And I went over and I'm thinking, okay, how is the Republican audience presenting this story? Because this seems like a pretty grim situation for the former President Trump. So I flipped over to Fox News, and they weren't even talking about that story. The story of the day was that it was Gay Pride Month and there was a gay pride parade or event at the White House, and one of the people that was a part of this parade was a big influencer, and they were flashing their boobs at this event.
Joe Biden says that's brave. Do you think that's brave?
That's an abomination and a disservice and disrespectful to the brave men and women on the beaches of Normandy. And my grandfather, who was a Navy corpsman fighting with the 4th Marine Division in the 24th Regiment in World War II on the battle at Iwo Jima.
They weren't even mentioning the Trump allegations. The main story was this parade was going on, and I'm like, if you are in an echo chamber and you're only watching one side, you're not going to get a full picture of all the facts and what's actually going on. It's the same with social media. It becomes sort of an echo chamber because you like and interact with one side, and then you get fed more and more from that side, and it's like this constant feedback loop. And as someone that likes to see both sides, I try to see both sides and be open, but it can be very, very difficult. And I can see how a lot of people in the US can be polarized to one side. But I also think that's why there is a big popularity of people like Joe Rogan or Bill Maher, for example, because they're not afraid to call out both sides and you can't fit them in a box. Those are the types of personalities and people that I'm drawn to, because they're able to think critically and form their own opinion and not be beholden to one party or the other. And I just think in Sweden, because of the fact that there is a multi-party system, it's much harder to put somebody in a box. And I'm not an expert on the Swedish political system by any means, but I do think it's interesting how the foundation of the two political systems and the news media, it creates different beliefs throughout the society. And here's a bit of a more light-hearted cultural difference that kind of struck me as odd being away from the US for so long. And it was the restaurant experience, going out for some meals in LA, for example. And I remember first getting ID'd at a restaurant when ordering a beer at the age of 28 now. That rarely happens in Sweden because the drinking age to have a beer at a restaurant or bar in Sweden is 18 versus 21. But it was sort of odd to get ID'd at a restaurant in the US. And then at the end of the meal, a lot of Europeans find this odd that they give you the bill and then they take your card and they go and ring up the card. So the card is actually leaving your site, and a lot of Europeans are kind of freaking out, like, what are they doing with my card? Are they in the back, like taking a picture of the numbers or writing down the numbers? It is an uncomfortable feeling for your card to leave your site, versus in Europe, they bring the portable device that comes out and then you can beep your card at the table. So the card never actually leaves your site. I don't know exactly why we do it like this in America. I don't know, if somebody knows why, write it in the comments, because I'm very curious why they do it that way and not the European way, because the European way just seems a little bit better in my opinion, but maybe I'm missing something. Another small but interesting nuance of American culture is the driving culture. Basically everyone in the US drives automatic cars. I mean, they do have manual cars, but they're much less common. Whereas in Sweden, it's much more common. It's becoming more and more common with automatic cars, but especially back in the day, it was always cheaper to buy a manual car. So a lot of people would get the manual driver's license, which allows you to drive both. In the US, it doesn't matter. You take the automatic car into your test, and once you get a driver's license, you can drive any car with that, whereas it's actually a separate test. So that if you want to drive a manual in Sweden, you have to actually take the test with a manual car. And generally the roads are a bit wider in the US compared to Europe. People have bigger vehicles a lot of times. But the one thing that really bothers me is that people will sometimes pass you on the right in the US, which is much less common in Europe. Normally slower traffic stays to the right, and then the left lanes are more for passing. But you just get slow drivers in the left lanes in the US that just don't understand the proper way to drive faster in the left lanes and slower in the right lanes, which can be very annoying. And then sometimes you get two cars that are just going the exact same speed. And also you can turn right at stoplights on red, which kind of freaked out my Swedish friend that was with me when she was like, "What are you doing? It's red." I'm like, "Yeah, but it's a right turn. If there's no traffic coming, then you basically just treat it as a stop sign," which I think is very convenient. I don't know why they don't have that in Europe, because it seems rather pointless to just be sitting still at a red light with no traffic coming when you could just turn right very easily. So that's just a very interesting difference in terms of driving. And the last difference I want to touch on in this video is the amount of patriotism in the US is a really unique phenomenon. I just mean, like, walking around my neighborhood, my old neighborhood back home in the States, there's so many people with like American flags, and there's this sense of being proud to be an American, which is not as common when you're abroad in other countries. I feel like Swedish people have a pride about being Swedish, but it's not like an external pride where every house in the neighborhood will be flying a Swedish flag. I find actually that the Swedish flag, it's associated a lot with the summertime. I feel like I see a lot more Swedish flags in the summertime than in the wintertime. And actually, if you go into the center of Stockholm, you don't see any Swedish flags in the center of Stockholm. Like I'm thinking like right outside the central station, but the Canadian embassy is there. So actually in the big Sergels Torg square, which is like the big town square in Stockholm, there's a Canadian flag, but there's no Swedish flags to be seen anywhere. And I always think that that's a little bit ironic. Whereas US people, they do have a lot of pride in their country, in being an American. I think that's something that is very unique in a way. I would say that there's many Americans that don't have the same sort of experience traveling abroad. There's a lot of Americans that don't even have a passport, for example. But you also have to consider the fact that America is a huge country. So to leave America and go to another country, if it's not Canada or Mexico, it's very difficult. We're very isolated. Versus in Europe, you know, you can hop on a flight and in 2 hours you could visit like 20 different countries really, really easily. And that's one thing that I actually like about Europe a lot, is that there's so many different cultures, there's so many different customs and languages, all very, very close by. And I find that in the US, I'm drawn the most, my favorite parts of the US are the big cities like New York, LA, because they're very multicultural. You have people from a lot of different backgrounds in these cities. That's something that draws me to the US a lot, this multiculturalism, this aspect. Whereas in some parts of the US, it's really difficult to get this multicultural feel. That's one thing I really love about Europe. But if I were to ever move back to the US again, I would definitely want to be in a place that has a very multicultural feel, because that's something that I really love, being around different cultures, learning different languages. And I think that's why I've sort of based my whole channel around experiencing a different culture. So if you're interested in about Swedish culture or American culture, or you want me to make more videos similar to this one, let me know. I hope you found this one enjoyable, and I'll see you guys in another one.